Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the 9th lecture in the BRED IGC Social Protection series. Following up on our lecture last week on public health insurance, this week's lecture is brought to us by Francois Girard at UCL and Joanna Naritomi at LSE on job displacement insurance. We also like to welcome Gustavo Gonzaga from PUC Rio, who will be helping out as well. We're very excited to learn from these two professors' years of experience. And just before I hand over to them, if there are any volunteers who would like to be made a live participant, please raise your hand and we'll take about 20 people who will be able to ask live questions in the Q&A. For everyone else, please put your questions in the Q&A box and limit the non-course related questions. So introductions are wonderful and lovely, but they do make it difficult for us to sift through and answer the questions that we want to. So thank you again. And I believe I'll turn it over to Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining this lecture. So today we are presenting our chapter, Job Displacement Insurance in Developing Countries. So this is joined with Francois Girard and Gustavo Gonzaga. And Francois and I will both deliver the lecture today. And as you know, this is part of the Handbook of Social Protection. And there's actually a fair amount of effort in terms of data collection that went into this chapter. So we also put a link here for the data details in case anyone is interested in understanding more how we gather this information. But I want to start off by defining what job displacement insurance policies are. So these are government programs basically aimed at offering financial assistance to workers after job loss. So probably you are already familiar with unemployment insurance, given the very large literature on this topic. But there are actually various policies that try to protect workers against the economic consequences of a job loss. And there is a typology that we use that we find quite useful that basically takes these 4 key policies that we see around the world and classify them depending on payout schemes and financing. So the unemployment insurance, the usual way that unemployment insurance is set up is that they are state contingent policy. So laid off workers, they get benefits conditional on remaining unemployed. So as long as their benefits will depend on how long they're unemployed for. And also it's financed through an insurance mechanism. So people that are working pay into the system, and people that are laid off, they can draw from the system. And the other type of policy that is actually quite relevant is severance pay type of policies. And here we're highlighting that it's government mandated because there are severance pay packages that firms voluntarily offer to workers as part of their compensation package. But this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about mandated policies that firms must provide workers with a lump sum of cash upon layoff. And this is typically also financed through an insurance mechanism, meaning that people that are working, they contribute to this, and when they are laid off, they access the payments. And there are savings types of policies that are also they're a bit more rare, as we'll discuss later, but we also see them across countries, which are severance savings accounts. They're lump sum transfers upon layoff, and they're financed through own savings. They're mandated savings while working. And also unemployment insurance savings accounts that actually are also savings-based policies, but they are actually state contingent, meaning that workers, they only receive benefits as long as they are unemployed, but it's actually financed through forced savings as well. So if we think about these four policies, I think it's useful to categorize them so we can trace actually how relevant they are across countries. And so what we see actually is that in sorry, it's a little sensitive. So in high-income countries, if you look at the share of countries that have this four different policies across time from 1910 until 2010, we see that an increasing number of countries have unemployment insurance and severance pay. So unemployment insurance is more prevalent than severance pay, but actually they often exist together. And these other types of policies, there's savings-based policies, they're more rare. If we look at upper middle income countries, actually the picture is a bit different, even though there is also this trend that countries seems more and more to have some type of job displacement insurance policy. Severance pay is actually more common than unemployment insurance. And if we actually look at the mid, sorry. If we actually look at lower middle income countries, the share of countries that actually have any unemployment insurance is still actually quite low, but severance pay is actually quite common across countries. And in low-income countries, actually, severance pay is actually quite present, even though all the other policies, basically, they don't exist. And so this job displacement insurance in general actually is quite prevalent, and severance pay is actually much more relevant for developing countries than unemployment insurance. And one thing that we do in the chapter is not only we look at like how common these different policies are across countries, we also look at how they are differences in how they are designed upon existing. So, for example, unemployment insurance in the places where it does exist, the generosity tends to also systematically vary across levels of development. So, unemployment insurance, for example, tends to be shorter. The duration tends to be shorter. So the graph here on the left is looking at the average UI duration depending on how many years the workers contributed. And we see that in high income countries, the average UI duration is systematically higher than in developing countries. And also the minimum contribution period that is required for workers to be eligible for unemployment insurance is longer in developing countries if compared to developed countries. But actually, upon receiving unemployment insurance, replacement rate doesn't seem to vary all that much, but actually, if anything, it seems that some developing countries have slightly higher replacement rates, and also severance pay tends to be higher in developing countries relatively to developed countries. And although, there, as I showed you, there is a whole, there are many different types of policies across the world, and severance pay is such an important policy across countries. If we look at actually how much we know based on what is published in top economics journals, it seems that unemployment insurance is disproportionately covered, especially in high-income country settings. So we still know very little about unemployment insurance in developing country settings. And these other types of job displacement insurance policies, such as severance pay and those other savings-based policies, they actually, there's very little on them in general. And and it seems like actually the evidence that is out there seems to be disproportionately coming from high income countries. So this is just to say that there is a lot of need for more research and evidence in this space. So what do we do in this chapter is to first describe some of these policies, as I already showed you, across developing countries, and also discuss conceptually how should we think about the usual incentive insurance trade-off in contexts where, for example, informality is a very relevant part of the labor market. And we also review the existing literature, and we highlight some key open questions that we believe are quite interesting and relevant for future research. So b before we go into the discussion about how to think conceptually about incentives and insurance in this context, I think it's useful to take a step back and think about whether these types of policies are even needed in these contexts. And the reason for that is that typically when we think about the rationale for job displacement insurance policies, there are two key motivations. One is an insurance motive. So the idea is that we want to help workers cope with the socioeconomic consequences of job loss. But there is typically also a redistributive motivation, because if workers that actually face higher risk of job loss and also potentially prolonged unemployment once unemployed, if they are also low earnings, have low earnings ability, this could be an efficient way of targeting these workers, of transferring resources to these workers. And so I want to start off with actually the second point of redistribution, because this is a key contextual difference between developing countries and developed countries. So if the just by design, right? Like if you think about job displacement insurance policy, it can only target workers that are formally employed. So there must be a formal contract somewhere where the government can observe and track whether a worker was displaced from a job. So this already restricts quite a lot the types of workers that can be protected in a job displacement insurance program, because we know that in developing countries, labor markets tend to be actually quite informal, meaning that lots of workers are working without a proper employment contract, which prevents the government from being able to actually figure out who is employed and who isn't. And we know from the literature that the formal employment shares increases as countries develop. So if actually these types of policies may become increasingly relevant as countries develop, but we know that today, like if you think about the average developing country today, the share of the labor force that is actually formally employed is much lower than in developed countries. And this is important because it's not only that the labor force overall is less formal, is that the likelihood of being in a formal job actually varies systematically with income across the income distribution within a country. So so this graph basically showing the average formal employment share across deciles of the income distribution, and the different bars are different country groups. And here we can see that in developing countries, these lighter blue bars, the higher the income bracket, the higher the share of workers that actually work formally. So what this means is that basically that redistributive motive could be a little bit weaker in developing countries, because actually formal employment could be actually a tag for higher income. But it's possible that the insurance motive is still there and could be actually strong if we think that these workers that do have formal employment contracts, they are exposed to job loss risk, and that risk, actually that potential loss of a formal job implies a significant shock for those workers. So let me talk a little bit about the insurance side. So if we took the data from Donovan et al. They were generous to share their data with us to track this quarterly flows out of formal employment across countries. So this is based on surveys, labor market surveys, and it seems like actually. In countries that have lower GDP per capita, you actually see this higher flows out of formal employment. So if we take this as a proxy for job loss risk, it's actually something that is actually quite relevant in developing countries. However, this type of gradient is not necessarily something that is well established, because there is other work right now actually that Francois is conducting with co-authors that shows that the risk could actually be lower using admin data from developing countries. So this is still debated, but this is just to say that there are relevant flows out of formal jobs that could indicate that workers do face a relevant risk of being laid off. But then there is also a question, like, okay, sure, maybe these workers can lose their jobs. They're not just like, say, public jobs that are, say, super high tenure. These are jobs that workers are flowing in and out of. But it's possible that perhaps they're just switching from formal to informal jobs that are quite similar, and perhaps the need for insurance is not evident. So using this data, we can also track where these workers are going to. So once they leave a formal job, what do they do? Do they work informally in a sort of wage employment, but informally? Do they work for self-employment? Or do they actually remain unemployed or inactive? And here, what we see is that it's true that a larger share of workers in developing countries, they flow from formal employment to self-employment or informal employment. But a large share of them actually do go to unemployment or inactivity. So it seems that this idea that they could just easily go and work informally or do some sort of self-employment activity is somewhat limited, even though it does seem to play a role here. But then the question also is, once they, oops, if they do if they somehow can self-insure through informal jobs or informal self-employment, how good are these sort of modes of self-insurance in terms of smoothing that shock of a formal job loss? And interesting, there is this very unique paper looking at data from Mauritius, where they are able to actually match admin records to survey data. And there they find, they can actually see, a worker that is laid off, and that same worker going to informal jobs, for example. And they also have a survey on consumer spending that allows them to see what happens to consumption as workers are laid off. And we see in the graph on the left that workers, once they are laid off, their likelihood of finding a formal job or being formally employed drops and remains low for a long time. And the likelihood of being formally employed does shoot up and it stays high. So it seems that there is this degree of potential self-insurance that shows up also in the data that I just discussed. But then the impact of that on consumption smoothing actually seems to suggest that this type of self-insurance actually limited in the sense that there is a pretty substantive loss in consumer spending after layoff. And this is important actually because, you know, one argument could be, well, potentially, you know, it's the mapping between this type of drop in consumer spending only matters the degree to which it actually affects utility, and we actually have some reasons to believe that the same consumption drop could actually indicate actually a higher need for insurance in developing countries than actually in developed countries, just because we know that, for example, from evidence from Cherry and Looney from 2007, that they compare what types of mechanisms are used to smooth consumption in Indonesia versus the US. And they find that in Indonesia, families seem to take very costly measures like removing children from school in order to allow them to smooth consumption. And also there is some recent evidence from work that Francois is doing in Ethiopia, showing that there are informal transfers within key networks that seem to be relevant to smooth some of these shocks, but we don't know what their utility you know, cost or what they are. So it might be the case that, you know, even though there are these alternative ways of getting sort of smoothing consumption, the need for insurance can be quite high. And another piece of evidence that I believe is relevant here is that it's not just about consumption. If we think there is a range of evidence from Brazil looking at what happens when workers are laid off from a job, a formal job, on criminal activity, including in domestic violence. It seems to worsen children's education outcomes and increase hospital admissions and mortality. And so there's a range of outcomes that really seem to be consistent with this idea that there is a pretty relevant socioeconomic cost of a formal job loss in these contexts. And actually, in these papers from Brazil, they show that access to unemployment insurance attenuates these adverse effects. So it seems like there is an insurance motive here that is relevant. So now I will hand over to Francois, who will discuss incentive insurance trade-off in these contexts.
Thank you, Joanna. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so what Joanna has shown so far is that the literature highlight that there is definitely a need for insurance in developing countries after job loss, and that some of the policies that we discussed can help mitigate the adverse effect that this that job loss has. Now, but if you want to go from this to actually what kind of policy should be implemented, you have to think about the welfare effect of these policies. And so you also have to look at the other side of the trade-off, which is the fact that some of these policies could actually create some incentive effect or create some economic distortion. And so that's kind of the point that we made in this first paper with Gustavo Gonzaga, published in the AJ in 2021. So we basically looked at the standard unemployment insurance program in Brazil, where there is a high level of informality, and we tried to essentially apply the kind of framework that was used in high-income countries to study the cost and benefit of an unemployment insurance program in that context. So what we show in that paper is that conceptually, the trade-off that has been highlighted in the seminal papers in the public economics literature on the topic by Bailey in the 70s and Chelly in the 2000s remained conceptually similar. So on the incentive side, the main concern with programs like unemployment insurance is that they might distort incentive to find a new formal job. So because you only keep receiving benefits if you are without a formal job, you have an incentive to stay without a formal job while you're eligible for benefits. That's kind of a standard moral hazard problem. Think about an insurance company that provides you an insurance contract. It's going to change your incentive. And so you might be more likely to stay in the insured state because of the incentive that the program creates. And then on the insurance side, the point of these policies is to help workers smooth consumption against two types of risk. The first one is the risk of formal job displacement, because you receive transfers after job displacement. The other one is the risk of remaining without a formal job. So you might want to transfer, you might want to have insurance not just against the risk of losing your job, but also against the risk that you might need quite a bit of time to find a new formal job. And so the seminal paper in this literature in economics is this kind of Bailey 1978 paper, which provides the framework that people use typically in public economics to study these kind of programs. And so it compares the two main job displacement insurance policies, unemployment insurance and severance pay. So it highlights the fact that because unemployment insurance is state contingent, in the sense that your eligibility depends on remaining without a formal job, then it's going to be better for insurance because it's going to insure you against both types of risk, job loss and remaining without a formal job for a long time. But it's going to be worse for incentive because it's going to create the substitution effect. It's going to distort your incentive to find a new formal job. So it's both giving you money, so there's potentially an income effect. You might search less for a new job because you have more resources, but then it changed the relative return of finding a new job. And so that creates a substitution effect. By contrast, severance pay being a lump sum at layoff is going to be worse for insurance. It's only providing insurance against the risk of job displacement, in the sense that all workers receive the same support, irrespective of how much time they spend without a formal job. But it's going to be better for incentive because it's not going to create the substitution effect. It's providing you with more resources, but it doesn't change the relative return of finding a new formal job. So now let me go over the two parts of this trade-off sequentially and highlight some of the literature from developing countries on these questions. So on the incentive side, what's motivated Gustavo and I when we started working on this question is that there is a common view that in a context of high informality, a program like unemployment insurance that might reduce incentive to find a formal job is necessarily going to lead to a larger efficiency cost because of a larger moral hazard problem. It's actually something that's it's a view that is quite common in that context, but for a range of policies that interact with incentive to find a formal job, you often hear this kind of view. When you ask people to articulate more clearly what they have in mind, you realize that it's a relatively loose argument, although it's pervasive, an intuition that things must have to be worse when workers have more margin of individual response, right? Because they can reduce their formal reemployment, both by staying unemployed and by working informally, it makes sense to think that the overall moral hazard problem might be worse. And in fact, when you look at the evidence on this topic, it's true that workers delay formal reemployment because of unemployment insurance benefits in developing countries. So it's not just the paper that we wrote, several papers after our paper confirmed that. And it's indeed true that part of the response comes from people choosing to work informally instead of formally in response to having access to unemployment insurance benefits. But a key point that we make in this paper is to ask, does that really mean that the efficiency cost is going to be worse in a context of high informality? And what you need to be able to answer that question is to provide a measure of the efficiency cost. And so before I get to that, this is kind of the motivating evidence in our paper. If you look, so this shows you the hazard rate of formal reemployment for workers eligible for 4 months of unemployment insurance or 5 months of unemployment insurance in Brazil. And so the hazard rate of formal reemployment tells you the likelihood that someone finds a new formal job if they haven't found yet a formal job after layoff. So what you can see here is that after month 4, workers who are eligible for 4 months, their hazard rate of reemployment spikes up, and that spike is shifted by about a month for workers eligible for 1 extra month. So that's clear evidence that what you are eligible for is very sensitive, has a big impact on when you find a new formal job, at least for some workers. Okay, this is just descriptive, but in the paper, we use a regression discontinuity design to show you causally that this is indeed the case. But so clearly there is a behavioral response here, but the question that we try to answer is whether that implies that the efficiency cost is going to be large. And so for that, you need to have a measure of the efficiency cost. And we're going to implement in that paper a typical measure of efficiency cost from the public economics literature, which is the ratio of two quantities, a behavioral effect and a mechanical effect. So the behavioral effect is essentially the all cost to the government budget that come from workers changing their behavior in response to a UI policy, to expanding UI benefit. That's a standard moral hazard response. If you think about an insurance company providing you with an insurance contract, their behavioral cost is all the costs that come from the fact that their customers might change their behavior and increase the cost of providing insurance to them. In the UI context, there are two types of response that matter. On the one hand, if workers delay formal reemployment, they might collect more benefits. So that's going to increase the cost of the program. On the other hand, if they spend less time formally employed because they delay formal reemployment, they're also going to pay less into the system. They're going to pay less in taxes because they're going to spend less time contributing to it while formally employed. So that's the behavioral effect. And then the mechanical effect is essentially the cost to the government budget that just come automatically from workers drawing additional benefits absent behavioral responses. Yeah? So if you decide to provide 4 months of unemployment insurance to workers, then whoever would have remained 4 months unemployed, even without any disincentive, would receive 4 months of UI, and that's costly. And so the mechanical effect is essentially the kind of the static cost of the program. The behavioral effect is the cost that is due to behavioral responses. And the ratio between the two give you kind of some sort of leakage ratio, right? So for example, if the fiscal externality is like 0.2, it means that you lose 20 cents for every dollar that reach the actual target beneficiaries. So this is a very short overview of that concept, but I highlight here like Journal of Economic Perspective paper that go a bit more into this if it's useful for you. Now, if you go back to the UI context, you can use this concept of efficiency cost to get an optimal unemployment insurance policy. That's a standard one from the literature that's also going to apply in our context. On the left-hand side, you have the social value of insurance from providing additional UI benefits. And this is basically, you can see it's the difference in the average marginal utility between workers who are going to receive the extra benefits and workers who are going to be funding the extra benefit. And so naturally, if the marginal value of a dollar is higher for people who receive the benefits than for people funding it, then there is an insurance value from making the transfer happen. On the right-hand side, you get the fiscal externality, which is the concept I'm just discussing. So a formula like you just tells you, if there is a high need for insurance because there is a big gap in marginal utility between the employed state and the unemployment state when people are eligible for benefits, then it's increased welfare to provide more resources to the beneficiaries. But you also have to take into account the efficiency cost. And so it's only if the social value insurance exceed the efficiency cost that it increases welfare to increase benefits. So that's the kind of a formula that guides our thinking in this paper. And then we're basically gonna try to estimate this fiscal externality and then to compare it to the kind of estimates that you find in high income countries. And so the variation that we use is the one I showed you in the graph before. We compare workers that are eligible for 4 months versus 5 months of unemployment insurance using a regression discontinuity design. And what we find is that the size of the efficiency cost that we estimate actually does not increase with informality. So it's smaller than comparable estimates for the US, so for comparable policies. But also Brazil is a very diverse country with regions with very different informality rate and level of development. So we also look within Brazil and we show that efficiency cost, if anything, is smaller in labor market with a high informality. So that goes again, this kind of conventional wisdom that motivated our paper. And in fact, so that was looking at variation in duration of benefit. There's a more recent paper that looked at variation in the level of benefits. and also find that the efficiency cost is in the range of the one that you find in high-income countries, despite clear evidence of behavioral response. And the reason for that is that it takes a long time for workers in developing countries to find a new formal job, irrespective of UI incentive. So for example, in Brazil, we showed about 50% of workers remain without a formal job 12 months after layoff, which is long after they've exhausted their benefits. So if most people are going to take a long time to find a new formal job, irrespective of incentive, then the mechanical effect is always going to be very high. Most people are going to collect everything they're eligible for, even without changing their behavior. And that's going to necessarily constrain how big the behavioral effect can be relative to the mechanical effect. And the same mechanism, because people take a long time to find a new job, it also means that unemployment insurance is going to be more costly to fund in developing countries. So if you think about this, the simple equation I put there, it's kind of the balanced budget of the government for a UI program. On the left-hand side, you have the resources. On the right-hand side, you have the cost. And so the TOR is the kind of tax rate that workers will have to pay when they are formally employed to fund a program. D would be the average time they spend formally employed per layoff, contributing per layoff. On the right-hand side, you have the benefit level, smaller case b, and then capital B is the actual duration of benefits. On average, how many months people actually collect. Okay, so you can see that if that capital B is higher, because people take a long time to find a new formal job for a given potential duration, something else to give. And so either you're going to have to increase the tax rate, but it's not obvious that workers will be willing to pay a higher tax to fund the program, or you can reduce the minimum contribution. You can increase the minimum contribution period. We saw, Jonah showed you early on that the minimum contribution period was higher in developing countries. And so if that's higher, it means that D will be higher per layoff. And that would be a way for you to balance the budget. So they're just showing you visually this point that it takes a long time for people to find a new formal job. We have other graphs in the paper showing you something similar for people who are not eligible for any UI benefits. But you can just see here that people take a very long time to find a formal job. Their survival rate without a formal job is very high. So you could you can just see that essentially this survival rate cannot increase that much because of behavioral response, just because it's really high to begin with. And so that means that the mechanical effect is always going to be high compared to the behavioral effect in this context. And so what we find that on average, it's about 20 cents per dollar that is lost to behavioral responses. And if anything, when we estimate that separately for all Brazilian states, and we regress our estimates against the average state level informality rate in Brazil, we find a downward sloping relationship. So there is no evidence that the efficiency cost is increasing with informality. So that was for unemployment insurance. Now, if you want to compare severance pay and unemployment insurance, well, severance pay is not state contingent, so it's not going to distort incentive to find a formal job. It can still potentially delay formal reemployment because of the liquidity effect, the fact that you have now more resources at hand. And actually, there's a famous paper in Public Labor Economics by Carcetti and Weber that show evidence of that. At least it was the first paper to show evidence of that using data from Austria, where they compare severance pay and unemployment insurance in Austria and find that severance pay delays reemployment too, but less so than unemployment insurance. And so because of that, the efficiency cost of severance pay is going to be smaller, right? So if you delay formal reemployment because of severance pay, if there is only severance pay, then the only source of inefficiency is that you're going to pay less taxes in the future because as severance pay is not state contingent, if you delay formal reemployment, you're not collecting more severance pay. You already received that one lump sum, but you might contribute less to the government budget by delaying formal reemployment. So that's for high-income country. Now, in low-income countries, we have some evidence from Brazil, paper by Brito, published in Restat, that shows evidence very much consistent with Carcetti and Weber that severance pay or some lump sum amount after job loss can also delay formal reemployment, but to a lesser extent than unemployment insurance, at least in the short run. And that means that unemployment insurance is always going to have a higher efficiency cost. And then recently, actually we are still wrapping up the working paper. With co-authors, we've been conducting a RCT in Ethiopia, where we provide a lump sum amount to displaced formal workers, and we find a big reduction in their likelihood of working in any formal job, actually in any job in the next year. So that's just to show that liquidity effect clearly also matters in developing countries where severance pay is relatively more important. So that's for the incentive side. Now let me go over the insurance side of the trade-off. So the key focus of the policy debate when you compare severance pay and unemployment insurance, it's really about this contingency policy. That's what the Bailey framework was all about. So because severance pay does not distinguish between those with short versus long spell without a formal job, it's not going to be as good as unemployment insurance to provide to help workers smooth consumption. Okay, because with unemployment insurance, you better target those workers who stay without a formal job longer, that you channel more benefits to them. So you're basically going to have a higher insurance value thanks to this contingency policy, which is also the same feature that creates higher efficiency cost. And in high-income countries, because workers are reemployed quicker, actually it makes quite a bit of a difference for workers whether or not they receive a severance pay versus a UI policy. Okay, because like if people are reemployed quicker, it means that there will be much more variation among workers. Some of them will receive very little under UI, some of them will receive a lot. But in developing countries, because most workers take a long time to find a formal job, this difference in targeting is kind of less relevant. Essentially, like, to the extreme, imagine that everyone, that no one can find a new formal job within 5 months, then whether you give a severance pay or 5 months of UI, it makes no difference in terms of how much money goes to different people. Now, that discussion is focused on the contingency policy, but there's another key difference between severance pay and unemployment insurance, which is about their disbursement policy. So the fact that severance pay provide a lump sum, while unemployment insurance provide tranche payment, provide kind of monthly or weekly payment. So that feature, abstracting from the contingency, it shouldn't really matter. Like in a standard framework in economics, with kind of rational agents, how you actually disburse an amount like this shouldn't really matter, because if you give a lump sum, you can always save it slowly and spend it the way you would spend monthly tranches. If I give you tranche payments, you can always save them if you don't need to buy a larger item. So you can, whatever consumption profile you wanted to have under one or the other system, you can kind of achieve it easily with either of the two disbursement policies, especially if the goal is to smooth consumption. But the key thing that's not true if workers struggle to save or de-save slowly or smoothly, whatever transfer you give them. For example, if they have limited saving technology, if they're exposed to kinship taxation, so when you have resources at hand, you have a whole network that you're expected to share with, or if they face some sort of prison bias problem. In this, with these kind of challenges, what you're going to see that consumption is excessively sensitive to cash on hand. You're going to spend whatever resources you have at hand at that time. And that means that the insurance value of severance pay is going to be weakened because instead of helping you smooth consumption for a long period of time, you're going to spend it very quickly right after job loss. And that's kind of the point that we make in this paper with Joanna, published in the ER in 2021, where we provide evidence for workers in Brazil who receive a lump sum severance pay at layoff and are also eligible for 5 months of UI. And it's a context where the incentive to smooth is actually quite high because job loss, because they receive a positive transitory income shock, this lump sum, and job loss is a real permanent income shock in Brazil. But then when we look at the data, so we have administrative data on consumption spending for these workers. So this graph shows you essentially a difference between workers who lose their job in month 0 versus people who don't lose their job at the same time. And so what you see here is that prior to month 0, prior to layoff, the two groups follow a similar trend in consumption spending. And then the group that is laid off and receive a severance pay, their consumption shoots up exactly after layoff by up to 30%. And then it goes back down. And around month 5, here when people start exhausting their UI benefits, you see a sharper drop in their spending, as if they don't have resources to smooth through that negative income shock. Now, this is not super sharp because actually some workers start collecting in month 1, other in month 2, other in month 0. So there's kind of a gradual drop here. But if you recenter the event analysis, around the months of UI exhaustion and not the months of layoff, you see a very sharp drop in non-durable expenditure. So, so workers display a lack of smoothing in anticipation of the expected drop in income at UI exhaustion, despite the fact that they receive this big lump sum at job loss. And this big lump sum, you see it whether people are reemployed quickly or not reemployed up until 12 months after job loss. This specific finding actually was found in the US as well. So it looks like this is a pattern of behavior that is stable across context. And it's not just at layoff when you receive the severance pay or at your exhaustion that consumption is very sensitive to cash on hand. If you look at each week within a month of UI, you see that, so the red vertical line is the week that workers receive the actual UI payment in the month. You see that there's this clear pattern within each month where there's a spike when you receive it, then it goes down, there is a spike when you receive it, and then it goes down, even in the last month of UI when you have a really big incentive to save. So clearly these findings are at odds with standard models of job search and consumption, even if you have a liquidity constraint in this model, as long as you have forward-looking agents. And so that's the point that were made in. So these kind of models are the one that you see in this Scarlett Hall paper that I mentioned, also in the Chetty GP 2008, which is a fundamental paper in the public economics literature on UI. So what we do in the paper, we show that if you just add present bias in these models, you can generate both a high propensity to consume out of liquidity, so the spike at lump sum, and a low propensity to save in anticipation of the negative shock at UI exhaustion. And so essentially, what we have in the model, we have this kind of beta delta worker, and we allow for sophistication because what we did on top of showing you the patterns that we showed you of estimating some model, I'm going to show you in the next slide. We also conducted a short survey with UI applicants in Brazil. And there we discovered that about 60% of respondents told us that they would not want to get all their UI benefits in a lump sum fashion at layoff, hypothetically, because they like the fact that the payments are monthly to help them control the expenditure. And then in the project that I mentioned that I'm finalizing with quarters in Ethiopia, we replicate these findings. So we actually even we incentivize people to answer. We incentivize the answer to a question about whether they would prefer to receive a lump sum or a similar amount in 5 monthly tranches. And more than half tell us that they prefer the monthly tranches because it helps them control the expenditure. And so in the paper with Joanna, we basically estimate a simple structural model from the literature with just standard forward-looking agent on the left. And so you can see that the empirical moments from our paper, which is this gray line, where you have the spike and then the drop at your exhaustion, the kind of the model in black cannot replicate this pattern with the kind of benefit profile that we provide that are provided to these workers at a standard kind of forward-looking agent with liquidity constraint would smooth consumption. But as soon as you add present bias, you can replicate these findings quite well in these models, and that's what we show on the right-hand side. But then, so that's an explanation that works. It may not be the only one. But then what's interesting when you estimate a structural model like that is that you can then try to assess some counterfactual policy that doesn't maybe exist in the real world. And so what we did there, for example, we showed that if this model is a good model of behavior to explain this pattern, actually you could think about providing something like severance pay in 5 installments, so replicating the tranche payment of UI, but without any adding any contingency. So people will receive the benefit irrespective of their formal employment. And that looks like a win-win strategy because you help people better smooth their consumption, and you don't create any substitution effect. So you don't really change people's incentive to find a new format job. But that kind of policy doesn't exist anywhere. And that's where this a new project with quotas in Ethiopia comes in, where we actually confirm experimentally this idea that that came at the end of our paper with Joanna. So what we did a randomized control trial with workers laid off from a garment factory in Ethiopia. So we have a control group, a lump sum group, and a monthly treatment group. The control group received just the statutory severance pay from the partner firm, so what the firm has to pay by law. The lump sum group received an additional one-off payment, mimicking an increase in the severance pay that come from the experiment. And then the monthly treatment group received, again, the statutory severance pay, but instead of receiving a one-off payment as a lump sum, it received an equivalent amount in 5 monthly payments. And what we find that consumption spending is indeed sensitive to cash on hand. So we replicate the finding from Brazil. We find a big spike with the lump sum. So when people receive the lump sum, their consumption spike. And we show here that this is driven by those people who actually wanted the monthly treatment. So people who express demand for the monthly treatment, if you actually give them the lump sum, they are the one generating spike. So that's very consistent with the sophisticated present bias worker that we modeled in the paper with Joanna. So, this is just some table from the paper. So on the left-hand side, we show you total expenditure in months 0-1 versus months 2 to 5 after layoff. The point estimates are showing you the lump sum versus the control, the monthly versus the control. So you can see that in month 0-1, when people receive the lump sum, that's where the lump sum consume more. In months 2 to 5, the lump sum is not consuming more, so they've already spent everything. But the monthly group is still receiving, so they are themselves consuming more then. And on the right-hand side, we show you the difference between the lump sum and the monthly for people who strongly prefer the monthly. That's the first set of estimates, versus people without a strong preference for the monthly treatment. And so in month 0-1, the spike, so the increase in expenditure for the lump sum versus the monthly is driven by those people who had a strong preference for the monthly, but receive the lump sum. And then, one thing that we also document here is that it's not just that the lump sum provide limited insurance compared to monthly tranches. We also find that workers who receive the lump sum amount take a longer time to find a new job. So it looks like payment in tranches also makes people more likely to return to the formal sector faster. Okay, so I've said a lot of things. This is just a slide taking stock of everything covered in this second section. And now Joanna is gonna go to the next, is gonna cover the next section.
Right. Thank you. So we covered here so Francois just discussed basically the usual incentive assurance trade-off that policymakers face when trying to design these policies, considering, and especially considering informality, as Francois highlighted. But there are many other aspects of policy design that perhaps change a little bit once we think about developing countries. And I want to highlight a few other key themes, but obviously there are lots of other topics that are relevant here. Let me just put this on full screen mode. Oops. Can you see it? All right. So an important, so first I was highlighting the issue of moral hazard in job search, right? And thinking about like, you know, if workers at the margin perhaps are they may have a lower incentive to find a job if they are protected by unemployment insurance. But another margin that is relevant as well is the separation margin. If we think that workers and firms could take actions that could change the likelihood that a job, that a layoff occurs. And in the case specifically of UI, one concern often is the possible increase of fake layoffs, especially if you think that workers could potentially continue working in firms through informal contracts. So basically, if they would access the unemployment insurance system and continue working in the firm. And this is not something that we should overlook because actually there is evidence from Brazil showing that actually dismissals and UI claims are responsive to UI eligibility for low tenure workers. So it's possible that this margin of moral hazard is relevant. One potential solution for this is some sort of experience rating of UI, which is something that is relevant for even beyond developing countries, because the idea is that if firms face a higher cost, if they lay off more people, they will internalize the cost that they're imposing in the system. The difficulty with that is that we actually don't really see much experience rating of UI in practice, possibly due to political economy factors. Sectors that have high turnover perhaps are the ones that are more labor intensive and are more effective at blocking proposals of this kind. There are also other potential solutions to this. For example, experience rating could be done at the industry level if we think of targets where firms that use the USI system more than the industry average could contribute more to shut down a little bit some of these potential political economy concerns. But this is actually, in general, we don't really see much experience rating in practice. And in Brazil, actually, a few times it was attempted and it didn't go through. And severance pay, actually, for this particular margin of behavior response, it's actually better in the sense that in the way that it's designed its usual form is experience rated, meaning that firms that lay off a lot of workers, they have to pay a lot of severance pay. But the problem with that is that, firms that are going through a downturn or firms that are already quite liquidity constrained, especially in developing countries, they would be particularly their position could be really worsened by the fact that they have to comply with these mandated payments. And we don't really understand exactly what is, we still don't know little about that particular dimension of the problem. And actually, Francois has some work now in Ethiopia to try to understand if there is any demand for layoff insurance from the firm side. And another aspect that is actually very important is state capacity and policy implementation. So unemployment insurance requires a lot of state capacity. If you think about it, like not only the government has to observe whether there is an employment contract that a worker was laid off from that contract. You have to have information systems that monitor workers, because you need to know how much each worker should get depending on their pre-layoff wages. They have to track duration of unemployment. If they're reemployed, they have to track that as well. So it's quite costly to implement. But that's actually this type of investment in these types of systems could be useful beyond unemployment insurance. So actually, during the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen that a lot of extra emergency assistance was channeled through these unemployment insurance systems. So they could actually become very useful ways of targeting and and disbursing benefits quickly. For severance pay, to some extent, it requires less state capacity in the sense that you don't have to create these complex information systems to manage the benefits that workers should get. However, you still need the state because you still need the state to enforce that firms comply with it. So the state shifts to firms, right? To the cost of having to give to workers the severance pay upon layoff and figure out how much they have to give to each worker and so on. But then, if it's not enforced, then also the firms may not comply. And actually, this is something, there is some evidence from Mexico showing that compliance is far from perfect. And we know that in Brazil, in some recent work that Francois and I have been doing, that actually a lot of the reasons why people seek the justice system in the labor justice is because of compliance with severance pay. But we still need to know a lot more about how state capacity affects the implementation of job displacement insurance, especially potentially even targeting of those types of policies if implementation is very uneven. And there are also relevant economy-wide effects that we know very little about. So we know from the literature in developed countries that these micro-level estimates of how people, how much people respond to benefits, they may actually not reflect well what happens in the aggregate, because for example, if UI alleviates some of the job search externalities that have been documented elsewhere, this could be, this could change how we think about the efficiency cost of UI. And this could actually be relevant for developing countries where formal jobs, they tend to be more limited. So maybe these externalities are more relevant. It's also, we don't know how the fact that these types of policies are available to workers change formalization decisions. And it's possible that these, if the workers actually value these policies above their costs, that formal jobs could become more attractive and potentially even increase formalization. And also another very important point that I think it's especially for countries where there is very little coverage of these types of policies, is that we should understand a bit more how these types of government provided or mandated benefits interact with existing forms of insurance, because it's possible that there are all sorts of informal kinship type insurances available to workers, that once the government steps in, it changes the availability of those types of insurance systems. So we know that, for example, kinship transfers are relevant in Ethiopia. We know that in Mauritius, for example, it's not that relevant. In Brazil as well, we didn't find much role for that. But we know that in sort of social insurance literature in general, there are relevant interactions between the formal government-run systems and informal arrangements. For example, social pensions, that it can affect fertility, how people cohabitate, and so on. So we know very little about these topics. So I think it would be great to see more evidence on that from this great audience we have today. And another point that I think is worth investigating is that because formalization is far from perfect in developing countries, the way we think about the unemployment insurance claims and the business cycle can be actually quite different. So, for example, in the US, typically UI claims, they rise in recessions. In the US or Europe, these claims tend to rise with recessions. But in Brazil, it's actually very different. They tend to be pro-cyclical. So when the economy is doing better and employment is higher, we see actually more UI claims. And this is just because formalization tends to increase with economic growth, and potentially the number of layoffs also increase when the economy is growing. So this is something that is also relevant in terms of thinking about business cycles. And also, I think that we need to learn more about these savings-based types of policies and benefits, because, so as I mentioned earlier, there are 4 different types of policies that we highlight in this chapter. Francois already covered quite a bit on UI and severance pay, but actually those other 2 policies, they are often discussed as well within this umbrella of job displacement insurance. So one is the severance savings accounts, and the other one is the unemployment insurance savings accounts. So the severance savings accounts actually are more common than the unemployment insurance savings accounts, but the unemployment savings accounts, they're quite prominent in the policy debates just because their design is very attractive, as I'm going to discuss in a second. The idea is that in their purest form, these types of savings policies, they don't really have an insurance component. They are just, workers are accessing savings that they build while they are employed. So in case of severance savings accounts, workers can withdraw the balance that is in an illiquid account at separation or at retirement. And the unemployment insurance savings accounts, the idea is that the access to these savings is contingent, and the disbursement is actually trenched in the sense that they receive bits of shares of that balance while unemployed. And if they find a job and there is still some balance in the account, that balance can be pensionable. So it's as if workers were always drawing from their own money. In practice, insurance can complement those things. So like, for example, in Chile, that has an unemployment insurance savings accounts, there is a solidarity fund that workers can tap into if the duration of unemployment exceeds their savings. So there, in practice, these things are more mixed than just insurance-based. But it's something, it's important to consider this carefully, because the typical motivation that we have for mandating that workers save is that perhaps they don't self-insure enough given the risk that they face. And it's hard to think about a model that rationalizes these types of this type of savings, severance savings accounts, because people are forced to save because perhaps they're present bias, for example, so they are not going to save enough. But then typically withdrawal is allowed in a lump sum at layoff, which is probably not a good idea if we think that present bias is relevant. And the type of the design of the unemployment insurance savings account, this idea of like accessing savings in trenches, can actually be quite useful, considering that smoothing effect that it can have, that Francois was referring to with unemployment insurance. And it's something that we have to consider, when discussing these policies. But the problem with the usual motivation for unemployment insurance savings accounts in this strange form is that usually people are not necessarily highlighting the smoothing effect it can have. But usually the idea is that it will decrease moral hazard, because the idea is that you're accessing your own money. So if you stay 1 month more unemployed, you will use your own resources. And also, if you actually don't use some of these resources, it's pensionable. But if the idea is that it's you can access these funds in the future, and people perhaps are present biased, it's possible that the fact that you will eventually access these benefits won't necessarily help with delaying formal employment. So this is something that I think we have to think more carefully about, given all the evidence that we have on present bias and these other effects of the way that we design these policies from the UI literature. Another point that is relevant, and I think it came up actually in the Q&A as Francois was presenting, is coverage. So there's a very large share, as we already mentioned many times, of the labor force that are effectively excluded, right, from these policies. And because they are informal workers, or because they are formal workers but with such limited tenure that they never really reach the contribution that is needed for accessing unemployment insurance. So a formal job alone doesn't guarantee access to these policies, right? And so it's possible that there are, that other policies could actually act as a way of providing some sort of insurance, given that so many people are in context where so many people are uninsured. One that came up in the questions is sort of cash transfers, these types of or conditional and unconditional cash transfers. But typically, the eligibility criteria is quite static in the sense that it targets more long-term sort of poverty than these specific shocks. And also because it's typically the criteria is very infrequently assessed because it's quite costly to assess need. So there is this very slow moving indicator that may not be capturing this variation in income from job loss. It's also possible, as someone mentioned in the Q&A, that middle class workers may not be poor enough to even qualify for these types of policies after job loss. So it's possible that some of these policies, they do generate some insurance value, but there is still could still be many gaps. Also, workfare programs that are actually quite common in developing countries that are employment guarantee type programs where people can work for a minimum wage, for example. They could actually be useful in terms of timeless support, in the sense that people could show up to try and claim to be part of these programs if they are laid off. The problem is that these programs, when implemented in some urban areas, sometimes they are actually not unconditional types of programs. Like there is some targeting that could prevent some of these people from some of these workers from accessing these programs. And also there is some concern of how timely these programs can be in terms of addressing needs when workers get unemployed. So it's possible that there's other types of welfare programs that you will see during this course could have an insurance value for workers that are laid off, but it's not really clear the extent to which they can provide insurance for workers that are laid off from a formal job. So just to quickly wrap up, to allow for some questions. Sorry, I'm having some issues here with my. Oops. So to conclude, as we mentioned in the beginning, historically there is less job displacement insurance in developing countries, but actually we see that there is an increased take-up of these policies across the world, and it's possible that as countries develop and perhaps labor markets formalize more, these will become more relevant. And what we try to do in this chapter is to review the main types of policies and really focus on how to think about informality in terms of coverage, need, and design of these policies, and also highlight significant gaps in the literature. Many of the questions that were asked also in the Q&A, they highlight that we actually know little about many aspects that are relevant for the policy. So there's a lot of different avenues for future research that we try to highlight in the chapter. And also, there's a lot of variation within this category of developing countries, and it would be great to understand a bit more, how these policies, relevant to design questions of these policies across the different types of countries. But that's it. I should stop here and perhaps leave some time for the Q&A.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I think it's okay that we went a little longer because I think we've answered more questions collectively between the three of you in the Q&A box than any other lecture. Yeah, 72 is quite a few. So that being said, we want to give a chance for anyone to ask questions now, starting with the panelists. Razan, I saw you put a couple into the chat, so I want to give you a first chance if there was anything unanswered there. If you want to just briefly have a follow-up, and then if anyone else would like to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand and we'll go through them.
Great. Thanks so much. And thank you so much for the speakers. That was a very insightful lecture. Yeah, I'm going to follow up on the last question I asked, actually, because I currently have an RCT in Jordan with Simon Quinn and other co-authors, where we look at refugees versus locals in Jordan in terms of giving them cash transfers and seeing the impact of that on their employment. And I've been thinking about like a theory of distinguishing, a follow-up to that project, a theory of distinguishing refugees from locals in terms of the frictions they face. I haven't come across any papers that distinguish the responses of these two sub-segments of the labor market. And there are many reasons to think why they could be different, like the networks they have, their background and skills, potentially language differentials, etc., and how they respond to the unemployment insurance. But maybe this subcategory of the labor market could be covered by other heterogeneity. So maybe it's not just refugees, locals. It could be covered, for example, by low and high skills models. So I guess my question is, are there any kind of papers that touch upon that segmentation? And then second, is it reasonable to think about this and develop this model, or do you think models that cover high skilled and low skilled laborers cover already that hypothesis? Which I'm kind of laying out here. So it doesn't have to be just high skilled and low skilled. It also is networks, and there are at least 5 frictions I can think of. So finances, networks, skills, and these are a few. So yeah, I guess number one, are there any kind of close papers to that? And number two, is it reasonable to think of developing a theory that looks at particularly that heterogeneity? Thank you.
We can maybe try to complement each other. I mean, I don't know any obvious paper that would come to mind. So probably what you guys are doing is probably addressing the first challenge, is like finding a job, especially a good job, like a formal job in Jordan. And so, there, I think all the friction that you discuss are very important. Now, what would happen? Like, would there be a terrorist effect if they end up losing that formal job? To be fair, that we don't know much about, especially this kind of a refugee, non-refugee difference. But if you think that this is like, for example, a particularly vulnerable group that is unlikely to find formal employment rapidly, then you can kind of go back to some of the themes that we discussed. If people can't, if there's some group of workers that just can't find a formal job rapidly, then you're not going to distort much the incentive if you provide them with like a unemployment insurance for say 5 months, because most likely they're not going to find a new formal job within 5 months. So it would be like giving them cash without any contingency. And it's also probably a group that for them finding a formal job might be like the benefit of finding a good job might be partially high, because the alternative might be worse because they don't have like network to get like, I don't know, relatively well-paid informal jobs, for example. And so, making sure that it's smooth between the good times when they have a formal job and the bad times is probably partly relevant for that group as well.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is kind of related to what Francois said in the end, is that the need for insurance can be very different, given what you described, that some of these, the same job loss could mean very different things for workers that are locals versus refugees because of these networks and this kinship, other types of insurance that perhaps they're not it's not accessible to them. So in terms of the need could be different as well, not only on the incentive side.
Great, thank you so much.
I think Robert has a question.
Thank you very much. So I just need to get a little bit of maybe your perspective in terms of how to make unemployment insurance more popular, especially in sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general. The prevalent trend is that mostly severance pay is the most common approach that is taken by most employers. But then applying the political economy lens and maybe the cost benefit analysis lens, bearing in mind the GDP of most African countries, what would you propose as the way forward to be able to make it unemployment insurance more popular or more accommodated in the African economies?
Yes, Robert, I'm not sure I was able to hear the question, but I think you were asking about how to make unemployment insurance more used in African countries, in especially low income countries. Is that right?
Yes, I mean in African countries, for instance, in Kenya, I think what we have had, we have tried a trial of universal basic income, which kind of really a pilot, but never really went well. I'm just trying to look at the broader aspect. What would make an employment insurance popular, bearing in mind the GDP of most African countries and the cost benefit analysis and the political economy lens together.
I mean, I think that's just an empirical question. To be honest, I don't think we have much evidence on this. I think the challenge in some countries, that's what John had discussed on state capacity, is that if you want to implement something like an employment insurance, you first need to have a good system to know like when people lose a formal job, when people re-enter a formal job, because you need to kind of, if you want to tie their benefits to their formal employment status, you need to know kind of in relatively high frequency when people are re-employed. And probably in Kenya, that technology exists, but maybe not in every sub-Saharan Africa. About making it popular, I mean, that's a key question. Like I think whether or not people are actually willing to pay for it, right? So probably, the benefit of it, I suspect is going to be popular. Probably after job loss, workers will it's going to help them. So I doubt there will be a pushback against that. But the money has to come from somewhere. And so the key question is whether workers themselves, the ones who are going to be eligible for the benefits if they lose their job, how much they are willing to pay for it. And that's a question we know little about. So in this project that I mentioned that we are conducting in Ethiopia, we try to elicit workers' willingness to pay for this kind of insurance scheme. We try to do it in an incentive compatible way, but it remains relatively hypothetical because we're not a government. We can't just afford providing unemployment insurance to lots of people. But it looks like people have a relatively high demand for it. So it may be that people are willing to pay for these kind of benefits. But it's very much an open question. Anyone who wants to work on that, it's a good idea.
If there's no other questions live, is there anything that you guys want to touch on from the chat? Any common questions or things that you wanted to elaborate on anymore?
There's one question about self-employment. So the extent to which job displacement insurance lead to more entrepreneurship versus a return to formal employee jobs. So I've seen a recent working paper from Brazil just showing like the extent to which people who lose a formal job end up starting a business. I don't know if they've enough power to like detect treatment effect from the same variation of unemployment insurance that we've been discussing, but at least like showing the extent to which it's happening, that that is done in that context. In the I guess in our project with Joanna, when we survey, we asked people how likely they were to start a new business. That wasn't that prevalent, I think, in that small sample. In the experiment that I discussed in the Ethiopian context, we see that people who receive a lump sum, they are more likely to start a business, but not by a lot. It could be the population that we study. These are workers in garment factory who are typically young women, and so they may not be as likely to start a business after job loss as other types of workers. We don't know about that. But the key thing is that although there's a small increase in self-employment with a lump sum, these jobs don't succeed, these businesses fail. And so after a few months, there is no treatment effect of the lump sum on self-employment.
Yeah, there's also a question in the Q&A by Vignesh Swara about steps to have more evidence for other developing countries, since most of the evidence that we presented in our chapter comes from middle-income countries. But there are some examples. This work that Francois is doing with other co-authors in Ethiopia is a good example. How can you do like RCTs in these countries to evaluate this? Some of these are important questions and very, very important questions in the literature. But the main problem, the main barrier is in fact lack of good data. One reference I like to use is the paper by Donovan and others in the QJE that we use a lot in the beginning of the chapter, but it kind of documents transitions in the labor market across different states, and emphasizing the informality state, and he makes they make a lot of contributions with respect to how developing countries different from developed countries in this respect. But definitely there's much more work to be done in this with regards to this question. Thanks.
And just one point, you can imagine how difficult it is to do an RCT in this context, right? Because like you need to know, like if you want to do a good RCT, ideally you would know that some workers are going to be laid off before they know about it. Then you would design your RCT, and then only they're going to learn about it, and they're going to be subject to to different designs. So this is just very, very difficult. In our paper, we can't do that. What we did, we learned at the same time as workers that they were going to be laid off, and then we designed these different payment scheme. So of course it's internally valid, so we can still see what type of benefits help worker more, but it's all like after knowing that you're going to be laid off. So the baseline could be already contaminated by the fact that you already know that you lost a job, right? So when we compare like the consumption before and after, the consumption before, that's before job loss, but after learning that they lost a job. So you have to be mindful that people might have already anticipated that. We don't think it's a big deal in our context. We try to show some evidence of that, but it could in other contexts. I think that's just a reality that we have to somehow deal with. The alternative is to have like extremely large samples, and then you're lucky enough that in your sample there is people who lose a job. But I mean, doing experiment at scale, it's also a big challenge.
So I think that's as good a place as any to wrap things up, unless Sabila has a quick question that they'd like to ask. But we are close on time, so if you could just keep it brief, that'd be wonderful.
Just I got a question in my mind, and I'm just wondering, for example, that does job loss means they become poor? That's why this cash transfers and insurance programs. What kind of because in my country we have this BISP. I'm from Pakistan, and the social protection programs are mostly for poor, right? It's not more because of the large informal sector. We don't have this good data available, and I'm wondering that what is the inclusion criteria for someone to be on this insurance programs? Is this poverty because of the job loss, or other assets in different countries? How these programs are different from each country within developed and developing?
So thank you for the question. I think that there are basically two main motivations for these policies. One is has to do with redistribution. I think what it's related to what you're asking, but actually the main idea of this policy is providing insurance to workers. So it's different than welfare. Like it's different than social assistance that like you're trying to lift standards of living or decrease poverty rates. Here, the idea is to insure workers against an income shock. So because it's an insurance setup, if like there is even a replacement rate, right, that depends on your pre-layoff wage. So workers that are higher wage will actually receive a higher benefit because the idea is to provide insurance, and it's a different thing than redistribution. However, there is often some redistribution in the system because some workers, they're often contributing and some workers are perhaps drawing more from the system. And if there is any, correlation in terms of like the workers that are the ones that are drawing more, they're using more the system are the ones that are more vulnerable. It has a redistributive element, but I think it's an important thing to distinguish the kind of policy objective, because the idea is not necessarily for these policies to be anti-poverty policies. These policies are first and foremost insurance policies that is about replacing income once workers face a shock.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that last question. We are going to have to call it there and just give a big thanks once again to Gustav and to Joanna and to Francois. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your insights.
Thank you
Thank you,
very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
see everyone the same time next
Thank you
week.
all.
Take care.
Thank you.